And live now coverage from the National Iranian American Council. They'll be discussing decertifying the Iran nuclear agreement. Some of the comments made recently by President Trump.
Hello, everybody. Okay, such a fantastic crowd. And you are all so young, it is freaking me out. Seriously, like, you're so young, it's terrifying. Hi, I am Nahal Tusi, I go by Holly. I cover foreign policy for Politico, and I'm really pleased to welcome everyone here today for what I hope will be a fruitful discussion. First, let me introduce our panelists, though I doubt I can possibly do justice to all of their accomplishments. Rob Malley is the Vice President for Policy at the International Crisis Group. He previously served in the Obama administration as Special Assistant to the President, Senior Advisor to the President for the Counter-ISIL campaign, and the White House Coordinator for the Middle East, North Africa, and the Gulf region. When I first got this beat covering foreign policy, I managed to obtain Rob's private email address, like very early on. But for the longest time, for some reason, I was too shy to reach out to him. And then when I finally did reach out to him, turns out he's actually a really nice guy. So I don't know why I didn't do it before, sorry. Now, going to the other end, John Glaser is Director of Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, which we in the press often just say the libertarian think tank, the Cato Institute. His research interests include grand strategy, basing posture, U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, the rise of China, and the role of status and prestige motivations in international politics. That sounds like everything. I'd never talked to John before, so I was doing a bit of research on him, and I found out along the way that there's also a John Glaser who is an actor and a comedian who used to write for Conan O'Brien, but you're not that guy, right?
That guy has no H in his name.
Oh,
I'm a J-O-H-N guy.
Okay. And Trita Parsi is the founder of the National Iranian American Council, also the president today. And he also is the author of several books, including most recently, Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy. So before we start the discussion, the National Iranian American Council has asked me to thank Representative David Price and his office for helping us secure this venue today. NIAC also wants to thank its partners, the Plowshares Fund and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Okay, I'm gonna sit down, so. Okay, can you guys hear me? Everything okay? All right. So let's set the table a little bit. Last week, President Trump announced that he's going to decertify the Iran nuclear deal. But for now, the US remains in the deal unless or until Congress reimposes sanctions on Iran. The president also has requested the Congress look at passing legislation that basically states that if Iran takes certain actions, including non-nuclear actions, that would automatically trigger a reimposition of sanctions. At the same time, the president wants Congress to pass legislation that states that the United States considers some parts of the Iran nuclear deal that are supposed to be time-limited to actually be permanent. The goal is to get the international community and Iran back to the table to negotiate additional agreements that address what the Trump administration says are flaws in the nuclear deal. At the same time, the administration is looking at other ways to counter what it calls Iran's malign activities in the Middle East, which it can be argued are many, from human rights abuses to backing terrorist organizations. So I'm gonna ask these guys like a couple of rounds of questions, and depending on the time, that'll kind of factor how many questions I have. for them. And then we'll open it up for audience questions. Feel free to get into the minutia. I know a lot of you guys are congressional staffers, and you want some real specifics, so feel free to do that. Okay. So John, let's start with you. Let's talk about the merits of the administration's argument here. Doesn't the administration have a point when it says that the way that the Iran deal is structured, it will make Iran stronger economically, and that once certain limits are lifted on Iran, that it will be able to return to some sort of nuclear program while being stronger? So why or why not ask Congress to step in and address these flaws, and then pressure the international community to devise a new approach to Iran? Why not?
So it's certainly true that the sanctions that were lifted under the deal will allow Iran to build its economy and improve things for itself. But this notion that I think there's a bias among, I think, both sides in American politics, that there's this picture of Iran as being implacably in pursuit of a nuclear weapon. And I don't actually think that's the case. I think they've actually kind of made a decision here, which is that they can go the route of greater engagement with the world. They can develop more trade with Europe, both East and West, actually. They can improve things domestically for themselves, and you know, get sanctions lifted and this kind of stuff by not pursuing a nuclear weapon. Or they could go another route, which is doggedly pursue a nuclear weapon and be isolated from the world, sanctioned by the entire world the way North Korea is, and sure, they would have their security guaranteed by a nuclear deterrent. But I think they've kind of made a decision that the former route serves their interests more than the latter. And that doesn't mean we should give up. We should still have a robust sanctions, inspections regime and so on. We shouldn't trust that that'll always be their determination. But I actually disagree with the notion that we need to constantly be have the assumption and the presumption that Iran is just doggedly in pursuit of a nuclear weapon. It's only a matter of time and a matter of how you delay it or how you prevent it. I think we have to kind of recognize their choice.
Trita, I kind of want to basically ask you the same question, and I guess I'll, add this to it. Why should we trust the Iranian government? I mean, this is a government that imprisons Americans, executes ridiculous numbers of people, is backing militias and terrorist groups across the Middle East. I mean, I could go on. Why should we trust anything that they say?
So, if this deal was built on trust, there would never have been a deal to begin with, because the United States would not have signed it, because it doesn't have trust for the Iranian government for some of the reasons you just mentioned. Nor would the Iranian government have signed it, because they don't have much trust for the US government, and rest assured, that mistrust has just been significantly deepened over the course of the last week. This was never built on trust. This was built on verification and being able to assess whether the Iranians are living up to their word or not. If anything, we're trusting the inspections regime that the United States itself helped design to ensure that the Iranians are not cheating. And we have to remind ourselves, particularly because we are within a narrative in which we say we can never trust the Iranians. Well, part of the test here was for the Iranians to prove that they can be trusted. And that's why they lived up to the end of the bargain. 8 times in a row now, the IAEA has issued reports saying that the Iranians are actually honoring the agreement. The entire premise was that over the course of the next 15 years, the Iranians would prove that they actually can be a responsible player within the international agreement by living up to the end of the bargain. And as a result, then they would come out of the position that they were in before, in which they had been in violation of the NPT, and there needed to be a path for them to be able to be in good standing again. And that period ended up becoming 15 years, it's staggered at some points, but the test was, can they actually live up to their end of the bargain while we are verifying and inspecting their capacity to do so and be able to catch them if they're not. And I have to remind everyone, particularly mindful of the fact that we have this narrative in which we always think they're untrustworthy. I'm not saying that narrative is wrong, but look who it is right now that is actually violating the deal and talking about killing the deal and talking about walking out of this deal. We have to face the fact that, unfortunately, if there's going to be a violation, right now it's far more likely that that violation will be first committed by the United States rather than by the Iranians.
Okay, so those are interesting points, but if I was a member of Congress and I was skeptical of this deal, one of the arguments I would probably make is something that Nikki Haley has said, which is, and I should say I'm directing this to you, Rob, that apparently there are like hundreds of sites that the IAEA has not been able to get access to in Iran, and that there's all sorts of things that we don't know about that the Iranians are doing, and the IAEA can't get access to them. So what would you tell that member of Congress? Because that's a really key piece. I mean, it's one thing to tell the IAEA, okay, you can access like these 10 sites, but we're not going to let you access these 5 military sites. I mean, why should we trust them?
So thanks, and thanks for all of you coming out. I want to comment on a few of the other questions you asked, but it will come to the point you just made, because it is at the core of what this debate is about. So one of the questions you asked is, well, why should we do this deal? The Iranians are going to benefit with the lifting of sanctions. The economy is going to get greater. Of course. I mean, the whole point of the sanctions was to pressure Iran to get to the point where they would agree to stop or at least put real constraints on the nuclear program. That was why we imposed sanctions. So, of course, once they agree to those concessions, the only reason they would do it is because we're going to lift some of the sanctions. So if we're not prepared to give them any benefit, any economic benefit, then we should, I don't know, what was the whole argument about imposing the sanctions in the first place? So I think that's number one. Yes, they're going to get some benefit, but that's because this was an agreement that was negotiated, compromise on all sides. What the Iranians got out of it was some economic benefit, the benefits of which I think so far have been vastly exaggerated. They got some benefit, but nowhere near what some of the critics claimed it would be. So that's point number one. Point number two, and you mentioned the fact the audience is very young, and that is quite noticeable.
It's terrifying.
So maybe too young to remember the days, distant days, 2014, 2013, when the entire Western world and Israel were focused on the issue of Iran's nuclear program as being the existential issue, an issue of war and peace. Maybe there was some hype there. I wouldn't contradict that, but that was the issue, and that's the issue that the Obama administration was determined to shut down, so that we were not faced with that binary option of Iran acquiring a nuclear bomb or us bombing Iran to prevent them from getting there. So that was the focus. And yes, there was a price to be paid, and the price was lifting some of the sanctions that had been imposed precisely to get Iran to make the concession on the nuclear file. Now you ask about, are there flaws in the deal about inspection of sites? This is one of those canards, and it's so hard because there's so many of them to fight back. The deal, and I was there, this was one of the issues that was the most robustly negotiated. There are no military sites that are off-site, that the IAEA cannot inspect. If there's some evidence that the United States or somebody else provides to the IAEA and says, we suspect, and it's not simply on some kind of whim, but we actually have some information that there's some activity that's taking place in a given military site, the IAEA has a means of requiring that Iran open it up to them, and there's a whole process for that to happen, much tighter, by the way, than what exists with virtually any other country. So this notion that there are hundreds of sites that the IAEA can't inspect, it is true that what the Iranians were insistent upon was that you can't go on a wild goose chase and say, we think that there's a nuclear device in the Supreme Leader's bathroom, so we're going to go inspect it. That was something that they said they were worried about. They didn't want the IAEA to go on a fishing expedition. But you provide some evidence, which Nikki Haley was unable to do, and by her own admission, and the IAEA's own admission, was unable to do when she visited the IAEA in Vienna. If you have some evidence, if then the Iranians refuse access, and they refuse any of the compromises that the IAEA provides, then that could be a material breach, and then we're in a different world. We're not there yet. There's not been a single instance of a request to visit a military site by the IAEA that Iran has refused. So this is one of those myths that are hard to combat because there's so many of them, but it's one of those that we're hearing every day.
Thank you for that, John.
Sorry, you can ask if you want. I wanted to make a quick point about the premise of your first set of questions
Go
because,
ahead.
It kind of assumes that there's a strategic calculus behind Trump's decision, and there actually isn't. And part of the reason we know that is because virtually the entirety of his national security team urged him to certify. There was no strategy behind decertification. All the strategizing that went on was by his national security team to try to figure out a way to placate Trump's irrational distaste for the deal, but not back out entirely. So it's notable, for example, that Trump did not impose sanctions himself, which he has the right to do. It's notable that he didn't announce a formal withdrawal from the deal, which again, as the executive, he has the right to do. And that's because virtually the entire world, the IAEA, the Europeans, the Russians, the Chinese, the US intelligence community, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, John Hyten, head of US Strategic Command, James Mattis, Rex Tillerson, H.R. McMaster. Again, this was everybody agreed that not only is the deal working and Iran is complying, but that it's in U.S. interest to stay in it. He's put us in a position where we have less leverage than we had when we initially negotiated the deal, which means we can't get more punitive arrangements or more concessions out of Iran. And they've made clear to Congress that they're not asking them to reimpose nuclear-related sanctions, which would be the thing that actually constitutes a formal violation or withdrawal from us, not the decertification itself. So that's making explicit that decertification is non-instrumental. It's not supposed to achieve anything other than to broadcast Trump's distaste for the deal, and his babysitters in the White House have tried to, make it as easy a landing as possible.
Well, that actually leads into my next question, but before I say it, I do want to make something very clear. I think a lot of people don't realize this in the public, and frankly, perhaps even on the Hill. The United States still has numerous sanctions on Iran. The only sanctions that were lifted were nuclear-related sanctions. So we still have sanctions related to their ballistic missiles, their human rights violations, and their support for terrorism, which means that it's actually very, very difficult, if not impossible, for most businesses in this country to do business with Iran. I think that's important clarification, because I think a lot of people think that the U.S. has lifted all of its sanctions on Iran, and it has not. And I do want to point that out, for people to know. So my next question, John, to stick with you, is now the president has thrown this into the lap of Congress. How is this going to play out? What would you predict will happen?
Well, it's interesting because when he made the announcement, and there's some rumors floating around about a proposal from Tom Cotton and Bob Corker that would essentially move the goalpost on the deal itself and try to basically unilaterally alter a multilateral agreement, which is not going to happen, and which would constitute a violation of the deal itself. But before that, the main question was, will Congress reimpose nuclear-related sanctions, as they have the opportunity to do within a 60-day window if the deal is decertified, or will they ignore Trump? And it looked like there was increasing momentum in favor of not reimposing nuclear-related sanctions. Senator Jeff Flake came out and said it would be unwise to unburden Iran from the deal's restrictions now that they've benefited from economic sanctions. Senator Rand Paul said something similar. Representative Ed Royce, chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, said something similar, that we should enforce the deal, right? So there seemed to be, even among the politicking that occurred during the deal signing and afterwards, a recognition that now we're in this deal, it is working so long as Iran is complying. We should not unilaterally back out and isolate ourselves from the world. So it might very well be the case that Congress doesn't reimpose nuclear-related sanctions, but it's going to be a close fight. It's going to be difficult.
Rob, you wanted to follow up on that?
Yeah, I mean, just a little nuance on that answer. I never thought that the President, the administration, or Congress would reimpose all nuclear sanctions, because that would be such a blatant violation of the deal. It would so clearly isolate the U.S. that I thought the administration and those in Congress who want to be tougher on this issue will not go down that road. I always thought, and I think that's what's playing out, is a different route, which I do think is dangerous. I think I wouldn't minimize the risk, which is exactly what the President announced, which is he wants Congress to pass legislation that would tie the reimposition of some sanctions, nuclear-related sanctions, to actions that Iran would take that are completely consistent with the deal. So, for example, as you mentioned, under the deal, some restrictions get lifted after year 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. The legislation that the administration is pushing and that some in Congress are supporting would say if Iran engages in activity after those constraints have been lifted, which are consistent with the deal, because the constraints will have been lifted, we would consider that unacceptable and we would impose sanctions. That's a violation of the deal. And I think the real test for Congress is to make that distinction clear. Yes, we could, legislation that says that if Iran violates the deal, we're going to impose sanctions. Of course, that should be the case, because that's what That's what the deal itself says. But for Congress to say we're going to impose sanctions that have been lifted if Iran either engages in activities that are outside the deal, like ballistic missiles or support for terrorism, or if it takes actions that are in the nuclear field but that are permitted by the JCPOA, that would be a violation of the deal. And that would give every excuse for Iran to then say, well, you're violating the deal, we could do the same. And all the benefits of the deal that, as we just heard, every expert, including the US government itself, says is working in blocking Iran's pathway to bomb, that would be gone because we're playing with the deal. And this argument that it's not a violation of the deal because nothing happens today. I mean, what would we say if tomorrow Iran announced, we're going to abide by these nuclear restrictions, but if in 2 years the US is not withdrawn from Iraq, all bets are off, we're now going to start resuming our program. I think we'd say that's a violation of the deal. I think we would say that's completely unacceptable because our deal had nothing to do with our presence in Iraq. So for us to now say, if they engage in activity that's permitted by the JCPOA, the sanctions are coming back, that would be a violation of the deal. That would isolate us from Europe. That would strengthen the hardliners in Iran, and that would put us in violation of the deal.
If I could just add one thing to what Rob said. So very clearly, what Trump is working with the Senate on right now is a measure that would be a violation of the deal, and very specifically looking for things that absolutely ensures that the Iranian will say no to it. The idea that you could have permanent punishment of Iran and then expecting Iran to sign it while you're giving them no sanctions relief, I mean, it's really preposterous. So the path that he's suggesting there is one that will ensure the deal will be violated, the deal will fall apart. And then he also said very clearly, if Congress does not do this, then I will terminate the deal myself. So here you have it. Both paths that Trump is proposing will lead to the deal being killed. So to then say that, oh, he hasn't killed it because he didn't do it on Friday is essentially saying that the only way to kill it if he does it in one move. Well, guess what? He's doing it in 2 moves, but he's still killing it. And to what John said earlier on, listen to what Rex Tillerson said over the weekend in one of the interviews. He said the real end game is regime change. Okay. So now we're starting to really
I don't think that was his exact words. Didn't he say, like, the goal in the long run is to get the Iranian government, people to get their government back, right?
Well, look,
that's a different thing, but I just want to be clear about that. Go ahead.
If you're throwing these things out there, then expect that you can have a negotiation with the very same party that you're saying, well, we're looking to see that regime gone. This is starting to look like Iraq again, in which we have a pretense of diplomacy, while we're actually pursuing regime change, a policy that quite likely will end up getting the United States into a military confrontation with Iran. You combine that with the fact that, as John said, his own opposition to the deal is irrational because everyone else inside his own administration disagrees with decertification and walking out of the deal, and with the fact that he's presenting Congress not with an option to actually have any choices of what to do, but to ensure that Congress becomes complicit in the decision of killing the deal.
Okay.
Just because I think what Trina said, just not even 10 seconds.
All right.
Basically, what the president is telling Congress is, let's violate the deal together or I'll violate it alone. I don't think that's a deal that Congress should take.
Okay, like, I think you guys can probably tell that this panel is a little bit stacked on one side, right? So let me play the devil's advocate, my favorite role. Trump isn't the only one that doesn't like this deal, all right? Our friends, the Saudis, don't like this deal. Our friends, the Emiratis, don't like this deal. And I'm looking at you, Rob, because you used to deal with these guys all the time. Our friends, the Israelis, do not like this deal, and they are thrilled with what the president is doing. Shouldn't we care about what our friends think?
Sure, although I think there's a little bit of an overstatement when you say our friends, the Israelis. You have senior, no, they are our friends. We have senior defense officials, security intelligence officials who say this deal is right. You have the former Prime Minister, Ehud Barak, who used to be defense minister, who said it would be a big mistake for the United States to decertify. So yes, the Prime Minister of Israel didn't like the deal before. He doesn't like it now. I don't think he speaks for Israel, if that's what you were saying, or for the security establishment of Israel, that at this point has said the alternative to this deal is far worse for Israel's security. And again, let's remember, it was Prime Minister Netanyahu who stood at the UN General Assembly and who had that famous cartoon where he showed that Iran was increasing its enrichment capacity and said, this is a threat, we have to stop it. Guess what? President Obama stopped it. So you're right, this is a stacked panel, but there's a reason for there's a reason that we could cite many others who have supported this deal, who are not suspected of any sympathy. But could I just say, in terms of our other allies, correct, the Saudis have an agenda against Iran, which we understand, and we have supported them militarily so that they could counter Iran's activities. It doesn't mean that we have to subcontract national security decisions that involve the U.S., matters of war and peace, to their preferences, because the ones who are going to be fighting the Iranians are not Saudi Arabia, it's the United States. Now, are there things that are not perfect with the deal? Absolutely. Number one, it's a compromise. If it's not an act of surrender by Iran, it was a compromise. Number two, if there are things that we want to still talk about, as there are, and you mentioned some, terrorism, ballistic missiles, the sunset clause, the way to address those is not to tell the Iranians today, by the way, the deal is no good if you don't accept these things, because then Iran may walk away, and all those problems will exist. Plus, we'll have an Iranian nuclear program that's going to start accelerating today, not in 15 years, but today. The way to do it is let's implement this deal in good faith for a number of years. Then you want to talk to the Iranians when there's a modicum of mutual trust. You talk to them and you say, you know what? There are things about that we still want to address. Your ballistic missile program, your support for certain organizations around the world, some of the limitations that expire. We know there are things that they want too. You mentioned the primary embargo. They still want that lifted. So have that negotiation. But you can't have it when the ink on the deal that has just been signed is not even dry, and when you're sending the message to the Iranians, our word is not worth the paper it's written on, because the next day or the next administration, we're going to walk away from it. Build on the deal that exists. Make sure that Iran doesn't move forward on its nuclear program beyond what the JCPOA contemplates. And then, yes, there are other issues that we have to address with Iran. We all know it because we have a pretty hostile relationship with them.
Okay, I'm going to ask my question, and I'm sure you'll get your point in at some point, Truda. Here's the thing, though. Like, I just have a difficult time envisioning this deal surviving. So my question is this. Like, should I go ahead, and I'm going to address this to John, but you guys can all jump in. Should I go ahead and write the eulogy for this deal? Because here's the thing. Let's say that it holds up, for the next 10 years or whatever. And then, you guys are thinking, all right, maybe now we need to come up with some additional agreements, think in the long term. But the Iranians have seen that the United States, is willing to elect someone who is willing to completely overthrow the previous administration's decisions. So if you're Iran, wouldn't you right now be making the calculus that, look, I don't care if this deal falls apart today or 10 years from now. We are going nuclear because we can't rely on the stability or consistency of the American system. John.
They'd certainly be justified in coming to that conclusion. However, we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which Trump has done Iran a huge favor here. He's driven a wedge between us and our European allies. He's on the road to isolating us from the rest of the world and the P5+1 that we negotiated the deal with. And Iran is still, at this moment at least, able to continue to trade with these countries and engage in robust diplomacy with them and improve relations. So Iran, in a certain sense, I'm sure they're nervous about the extent to which they can trust that we'll abide by the deal. But they're also in a interesting strategic position that we've kind of given to them on a silver platter. Before we talked, you said that you're going to enforce long answers, and so just
I said I'm going to cut you off.
That's what I mean, yeah. Throw something very sharp at me if I go on too long, because I want to say something that's controversial, and it doesn't actually win me a lot of friends, even among my fellow JCPOA supporters. There's this bipartisan consensus that Iran's other regional activities are a major threat to the United States. And this is actually one argument in favor of the JCPOA. Like, we have the nuclear issue over here in a box. Now we can more ably confront Iran on its other regional activities, whether it's support for terrorism or ballistic missiles or what have you. The reality is none of Iran's regional behaviors pose a serious threat to the United States. Let me say that again for emphasis. None of Iran's regional behaviors pose a serious threat to the United States.
Okay, hold on.
Hold on.
No, hold on.
Let me explain.
We have troops in Iraq.
Yes.
We have troops in Syria. I'm sorry. I don't buy that.
I will
Go ahead.
explain, and then you will buy it. Only under the most expansive definition of U.S. national interests can you even plausibly frame these issues as being a threat. To put it slightly differently to address your objection, Iran's regional behaviors are only a threat to the United States to the extent that we continue to insist on sticking our nose in a region whose strategic importance has been massively overstated for generations. There's essentially three strategic justifications for our excessive over-involvement in this region: Israel, terrorism, and oil.
But those are really important things.
No, they're not. Listen, Israel, first of all, is powerful and strong enough to defend itself. It doesn't need the United States. And from our perspective, they're more of a liability than an asset, to be blunt about it. Secondly, terrorism. It turns out, other than terrorism being the most egregiously inflated threat in the history of U.S. foreign policy, it turns out the application of military force is not all that effective a tool in addressing the problem. We've done more to exacerbate the terrorism problem through our approach in the region post 9/11 than to mitigate it, and it certainly hasn't diminished the already extremely low probability threat of an American being killed by a terrorist here in this country. Third, oil. Many of our forward deployed bases in the Persian Gulf are purposed to deter Iran from attempting to close the Strait of Hormuz. That is an extremely unlikely scenario. First of all, they export most of their oil through the Strait, so they'd be damaging themselves economically by doing this. And all of Iran's regional rivals, many of whom have far superior conventional military capabilities than Iran does, also think it's a vital interest that the Strait stays open. And on top of all this, we have rapid deployment capabilities that can respond to such unlikely contingencies from offshore. So we can easily take a step back from this region and not damage our interests seriously. So when you hear about how Iran's support for Hezbollah and Hamas threatens the United States, how? These groups have local concerns, and we could easily make that none of our business tomorrow if we wanted to.
Okay, that's definitely the libertarian in you speaking.
I got to jump in here.
All right, fine.
Okay, I mean,
2 minutes.
I am on the panel now. You mentioned that we should listen to our friends. I think you're absolutely right. That means we should listen to the Brits. We should listen to the Germans. We should listen to the French. We should listen to the South Koreans, to the Indians, to everyone else of our allies who actually support this deal. You managed to exhaust the list of opponents, and there's 3 of them.
Yeah, but they support the deal because they have business interests there. It's about making money.
Oh my God. If you think that the Europeans are going to sacrifice the American market for the tiny Iranian market in comparison, and that this actually is not about security, that they were never actually genuine about trying to prevent proliferation, I think that's quite an insult to our friends. You're not listening to them. You're insulting them by saying this. Moreover, those 3 nations that you mentioned that are opposed to it, and Rob is quite right. In the case of Israel, it is the prime minister and part of the political elite. It is not the security establishment. There also happen to be 3 countries in which either their governments or parts of their governments have been on record, inadvertently at times, supporting military action against Iran. And I think there is a bit of a correlation in between there. Because if you are killing this deal, a deal that prevented both Iran from getting a nuclear weapon and prevented war between the United States and Iran, took those 2 options off the table. If you kill the deal, you put those 2 options back on the table.
Okay, but here's something that, maybe both you and Rob can touch on. You made the point that, oh my gosh, why would the Europeans ever pick the Iranian market over the American market? But if I was Trump, or one of the people who supports what he's doing right now, I would say the same thing. I would be like, look, we can decertify, we can impose the sanctions back on, and the Europeans, in the end, will come along with us because they care about our market more than they care about that market.
If it was just about economics, perhaps that would work.
What do you think, Rob?
It might work. I don't know. That's why I am worried about this deal. You asked earlier, should we write the eulogy? I don't know. I hope not. I hope Congress will stand up to what is a really self-inflicted move or self-inflicted wound by the administration. I hope that others will stand up. Is it possible that if the administration really goes through with this and tells the Europeans, you choose our market or the Iranians? Who knows what happens? But that's not a good scenario, and it shouldn't be a good scenario for the administration, because that means at that point, and I think the Iranians have made that as clear as can be, if they have to live under the constraints of the nuclear deal, but they're not getting the economic benefits, which are the only benefits they're getting out of this deal for now, then why would they stick to it? So then we'd be in a position where Iran will say, thank you very much, the inspectors are going home, the constraints are forgotten, and we will resume the nuclear program that a few years ago we were saying, and Prime Minister Netanyahu was saying is an existential threat. So sure, it might work, but that's the worst outcome, which would be the end of the deal. So this is where, if the administration's calculation is, we're going to try to pressure Iran to change the terms of the deal, and we could do it through the Europeans or others, I guarantee you it won't work. It will not work. The deal will not be changed this way. The only way that you could have a supplemental deal is by implementing this one in good faith. So I'm not contradicting you. I think that many businesses are going to say, you know, we have this American market, we cannot sacrifice it, no matter what our leaders may say about how we need to stand firm. But that, for me, is a nightmare scenario where you're going to see Iran say goodbye to this deal. And I don't see where we have a better alternative on offer right now.
Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question before we open it up to the floor for a while. And I guess I want you guys all to kind of jump in quickly. Put yourself in the mind of someone who opposes this deal, okay? And say you are advising a member of Congress about what to do. What strategy would you give them to follow? You oppose the deal. Pretend you're Mark Dubowitz.
You want us to give advice?
Yeah, I
Mark
do.
Dubowitz? Okay. Let me take an approach to this, if that's okay. I was actually quite surprised that during this debate in 2015 and still today, I think one of the arguments that could be used against the deal, I don't happen to agree with it, but unlike many of the other arguments, actually have a basis. Whereas many of the other arguments, oh, we don't have access to these sites and, you know, things like that, frankly, are factually incorrect, is that at the end of the day, this deal ended decades-long policies of the United States pursuing an all-out isolation and containment of Iran. It's a deal that by virtue of striking a deal with Iran, the United States recognized, for better for worse, that Iran is a major player in the region and that we're going to have a more effective strategy if we actually recognize that and try to talk to them and make deals with them rather than thinking that an all-out containment strategy could work. From the perspective of the United States, even if you don't take the position John took right now of saying, look, the region carries no strategic value, I would have a variation of that of saying that I think the strategic value of the region has plummeted for a variety of reasons, not to say that it was never important, combined with the fact that the cost of getting involved in this region has skyrocketed, because it is one thing to be the hegemon of the region when it is actually a relatively functioning region of functioning states. It's a completely different proposition to be the hegemon of a region that has 3 failed states in it and potentially 2 additional ones in the next couple of years. You're responsible for security in that region. Why would anyone want to be that? So, and then combine that with the fact that ultimately, as a superpower, the United States' global priority has to be to make sure that there are no global peer competitors emerging that can challenge the United States. Not a country like Iran that might challenge the US regionally, but there's someone that actually can challenge the US on a global scale. There's no country in the region that can do so. Forget about Iran, and certainly the Houthis are not going to be a peer competitor of the United States. But there are countries in East Asia that can. And the more the United States gets bogged down in what is essentially strategically marginal conflicts, the less of a capacity it will have to be able to address these challenges that will be coming in the next decade or two. So, but from the perspective of some in the region, whether you are Saudi Arabia or one of the other countries, that doesn't figure in because you are faced with an Iranian rival. You cannot balance Iran on your own, so you want the United States to do the job for you. If you're in Saudi Arabia, perhaps that makes sense. But I'm not seeing the answer being, the question being answered in Washington. What's in it for the United States to essentially become a proxy of Saudi Arabia in its own rivalries with Iran?
So you're actually basically using Trump's argument that the U.S. should do an America First national interest approach to everything.
No, he's not making an America First national. He's making a Saudi First.
No, but you're actually, this is the thing, is like there is this inconsistency in what he sometimes says about national interest. And so you're actually using that argument against his position on the Iran deal.
Well, of course, countries will pursue their own national interests, but there's one thing to have a black and white, zero-sum approach to the world of essentially saying if it's good for the rest of the world, it's bad for the U.S. And if it's good for the U.S., it's bad for the rest of the world. That's not how the world works. There are win-win solutions. The nuclear deal is a prime example of that. And that's why we actually have allies, because we have the capacity of being able to bring about positives for not just for ourselves, but others as well.
Okay,
the way he's doing it is to essentially say, since I'm for America, I'm against the world. And I don't think that works.
But you did not really answer my question. And I'm going to jump over and go to John, because there are people here who advise congressmen. And, you know, some of these congressmen are going to want to know how can they get out of this deal and, you know, what strategy would they have that they can justify it? What would you tell them, John?
I want to piggyback off something Trita said. And I can try to sort of shoehorn it into your question, which is impossible because the deal is working and effective and in our interest. But he touched upon something crucial, which is that, in a way, the real value of this deal is not what it literally accomplishes. Right? What it literally accomplishes is the rollback of Iran's nuclear program and the prevention for at least the foreseeable future, maybe forever, of its weaponization. That's what it literally accomplishes. But the actual value to the United States is that it erects a psychological barrier to the United States going to war with Iran for utterly imaginary reasons and conflicts of interest. And this is kind of what I said before. And Trita is also right to point out that part of our position in the region, part of our overall posture, has been to subordinate our own interests for the sake of other people's interests. So it's true that Israel, in private meetings with US officials, urged a more hawkish and perhaps militaristic approach toward Iran. It's true that Saudi Arabia urged us to cut the head off the snake or what have you. They should, if they want to take that approach, they can, but we should think about our own interests. And it's a pity that Trump has muddied the waters with sort of different ideas about foreign policy, because first of all, to have ideas about foreign policy, you have to actually know something about the world, and he doesn't. But in terms of what conservatives who don't like the deal should be arguing, I think they should take the approach that the extreme right-wing hawks that support the deal have taken. Condoleezza Rice, Jim Mattis, H.R. McMaster, the latter two who fought Iranian forces in Iraq, right, on the ground. They're not, this isn't code pink in the Trump administration. They are arguing that we stay in this deal because it effectively rolls back Iran's nuclear program, and that we can fight them on these other issues that I have unfortunately isolated myself on that aren't actually threats.
Rob, I'm sure Congress people would love to get your strategy on it because you're Rob.
No, so I say, listen, I'll be candid. I've spoken to critics of the deal. I've always thought the strategy, the tactics that they're employing now were the right ones if you wanted to kill the deal. In other words, say we're not against the deal, we're not getting out of the deal, we're just trying to improve it on the margins because we don't like the sunset clause. Who could like the sunset clause? Or because we don't like Iranian terrorism. Who likes Iranian terrorism? So that was the way to do it. They suffered from one major flaw, which comes from the president and from some of the people outside. The cat is out of the bag. They've made it lucidly clear as can be, that they want out of the deal. President Trump has said it. Others have said, not just out of the deal, but as Trita said, they sometimes even have hints of regime change thrown into it. So it's hard now to play that game of saying, oh, we don't want to get out of the deal. All we're trying to do is to improve it, when it is so clear, including from what the president said just a few days ago when he says, if I don't get my way, we're leaving the deal. It makes it, in my view, it makes it very hard for a member of Congress who would like to get out of the deal but doesn't want to be doesn't want the U.S. to be viewed as responsible for it, to play that game anymore, because it's in plain view. The president has made it clear to everyone, this is the objective. The objective is to find a way for us to get out of the deal, or to take away all the benefits that Iran's going to get from it so that they walk away. Knowing that, you can't unknow that anymore, and so I don't know that you could really make a clever argument anymore. I think it was the right approach, but it was polluted from the beginning by the admission, very honest admission, that the goal was, we hate the deal, it's the worst deal ever negotiated, we got to find a way out of it.
Folks, anyone with any questions? That gentleman right there, go ahead. And do we have a mic, or, okay, please, if you could take it. And please tell us your name and who you're with.
Hi, my name is Sonny Christopher. I'm with Senator Udall's office. I just wanted to know, in looking at this big picture, if the deal is killed, what effect would that have on renegotiating in terms of the next administration? Would that make Iran more or less likely to cooperate to a greater degree with the next administration if, the Trump administration does kill it?
How about John? Can you take that?
It'll make them certainly less likely to negotiate because they see the United States as less trustworthy. But it's also something, I have to re-reference something I said in the beginning, that if we're trying to renegotiate aspects of the deal, and when the rest of the world thinks that it's working and that we should just stay in it, then we have less leverage than we had I mean, the Obama administration did a lot of work, and Rob knows a lot about this at a granular level, to bring the world along in the sanctions regime and really ratchet up the pressure against Iran. and they ended up making very significant concessions. If we're alone, and we don't have the leverage over either our allies or over Iran that we used to, there's no way you can get more out of Iran with less leverage. It just doesn't work like that. So yes, it's a very challenging obstacle for the next administration, how to fix what Trump is in the midst of destroying.
If I could just add something. There's an Ayatollah somewhere in Tehran right now with a huge smile on his face. Because his narrative that the United States cannot be trusted has, in the eyes of a very large sector of the Iranian politics, now been vindicated. The hardliners in Iran from the outset said, oh, okay, go ahead, negotiate, but we don't trust it. The United States eventually is going to kill this deal. They're not going to be true to their word. And in the view of many people in Iran right now, even those who strongly oppose the Ayatollah's skepticism of the United States, perhaps paranoia of the United States, that's now been vindicated. And this has come at the expense of the moderate elements in Iran who made the argument, look, let's strike a deal. Let's see if we can work this out. Perhaps there will be additional changes in the policies of both sides. Zarif tweeted in the last weeks of the negotiation that this could be the floor instead of the ceiling, that this could be the beginning of additional changes rather than making sure that this is it and nothing else can happen. Well, after this has happened, it's going to be very difficult for anyone in the Iranian political elite to, in private but decisive meetings, make the argument for negotiations with the United States. Something dramatic needs to change on this side before I see anyone over there risking their political career by making that argument.
Do you want to weigh in on that too?
I mean, the only point I'd make, I agree with everything that my two colleagues said, is during the negotiations, what is quite ironic is that when the Iranians would complain about some of the tough requirements that we put in the deal to try to tie them down, they'd say, we would argue that we don't know what's going to happen in Iran. There could be a change. There could be a new supreme leader who may not. So we have to guarantee against future change. They would say the same to us, and our argument was, we have a system in which, sort of by tradition, presidents respect the legacy of their predecessors. So you don't need to worry about that. Of course, Zarif didn't take us at our word, but that was the dynamic. In truth, we didn't suspect that there would be the next administration that would come around and say, we're going to tear this up. I think, as was said earlier, exactly the points my colleagues made. Number one, why would Iran trust us? Why would those in Iran who don't want to trust us now? And how can you get a better agreement with less leverage and less of a coalition? That just doesn't compute.
Next question. Lady right there. She gave me her business card, and I really appreciate it. And by the way, you guys all, that's the price of admission. I need your business cards before you leave, okay?
Hi,
Very important for me.
my name's Erica. I'm with Congressman Williams' office. I just want to say I think it's kind of unfair to discount concerns by Israel when even during the deal, there was rhetoric calling for Israel to be wiped off the map and calling America the Great Satan. And I'd just like y'all to speak towards a little bit about that rhetoric. And also, we now know that there's sites like Parshin, I think that's how you say it, that were we didn't know about, and we do. So just address those two things, I guess.
Rob, can you take that one?
Sure. Listen, I think it's clear from the record of the Obama administration that the defense of Israel, and I know John expressed a controversial view. I think it's worth articulating and hearing it, but let's take your question at its face. It is true that Israel feels that Iran is a threat to their security. The question is, and this is a question that I think President Obama tried to answer, is Israel more secure with an Iran that's moving towards a potential nuclear bomb or one that is not? And that's the conversation. He had so many conversations with Prime Minister Netanyahu about it, in which he said, I get your concerns. We may not entirely agree on how to approach Iran, but let's at least agree that if we have a deal that at a minimum for the next 10 to 15 years, ensures that Iran can't move towards a nuclear bomb without us knowing right away and we'll be able to stop them. That's better. That's much better than having the alternative. So that's on that point. On Parchin, not only did we know about it, that was one of the sticky points of the negotiation, to make sure that the IAEA would have access so that they could find that issues past military, what's called the PMD, the past military dimensions of Iran's program would be addressed. It was addressed. That's why we were able to move forward with the deal. If there's evidence today And not only has none surfaced, but when Ambassador Nikki Haley went to Vienna, she afterwards said, no, it's true. We didn't provide any evidence of a suspicious activity taking place in a military site. If that evidence is put forward and the IAEA goes through the process of demanding access and Iran says no, 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 then we face a real problem. If it's not resolved through the conflict dispute resolution mechanism of the JCPOA, then we are in our rights to say that Iran has violated the deal. And by the way, we'd have our allies with us. As Trita said, let's listen to them. If they agree with us, which they would, if Iran were to bar access in an illegitimate way to a military site. But that's not what we have today. I mean, nobody has come up with that evidence. So there are some, echoes of Iraq here, and I think we have to be very careful of an administration that is manipulating or manufacturing evidence, leading us down a path that we've seen before.
Look, I don't want to see anything bad happen to Israel either. But unfortunately, Netanyahu's comments get more attention than the comments from the expert community in the military and intelligence establishment in Israel. The vast majority of whom have said this is a good deal because it staves off an Iranian nuclear weapon, which we don't want to see. Just like Rob said, it's better to have a nasty Iran that doesn't have nuclear weapons or is further away from them than the one that has close, a breakout time of a few months.
Let's take a question from this side. Lady right there.
Hi.
Hang on. All right, there you go.
Thanks so much. My name is Deborah Shushan, and I am the Director of Policy and Government Relations at Americans for Peace Now. It's a pro-peace, pro-Israel organization, so if any of you are interested in talking about Israeli interests, my organization is very much pro-Iran deal. We're working to preserve it. So my question for you all is, I want to flip Nahal's question on its head, the question being, how would you advise opponents of the deal to kill it? My question is, as someone with an organization that's working to save this deal, what advice might you have about ways in which organizations like mine and like yours, of course, Trita, as well, can push Congress people who are perhaps on the fence about the deal and on, say, cork or cotton legislation, to give them a little backbone such that they might save this deal? What advice do you have?
Trita, that's all you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for what you have been doing on not only this issue, and many other issues. I would say the first thing is that in order to actually be able to not only save the deal, but most importantly, make sure that there isn't a war and that there isn't a nuclear weapons program in Iran at some point, the critical thing is to make sure that this deal is protected. And that means don't engage in any type of a conversation or negotiation that would try to see, okay, how can we get some form of a sanctions in place in the hope that they're not in violation of the deal? Because that will end up being a death of this deal by 1,000 paper cuts. Instead, if you truly want to strengthen this deal, then we should do the one thing that has worked in the last 37 years. There's plenty of concerns on the American side about Iran, many of them very legitimate. Of the past 37 years, there's only one example in which the United States actually successfully has managed to change or amend an Iranian core policy in a significant way. And that is through this multilateral negotiation with America's closest allies. That's the only time. Everything else has only tended to make the conflicts more difficult. In fact, if we were so adamantly optimistic about the effect of our sanctions, why is it that we have all of these problems today after 30 years of sanctions? Shouldn't those sanctions at some point have produced some sort of a result in which we could say, well, the Iranian support for Hezbollah is less, et cetera, et cetera? It hasn't. On the contrary, according to the Hawks, the Iranians are in a stronger position than they ever have been after all of these years of sanctions.
Well, the sanctions did bring them to the deal. I mean, the sanctions did bring them to the negotiating table for the deal.
I strongly disagree with that narrative, and you will see that in my book about what actually happened in the secret negotiations. In March 2013, the United States, for the first time in secret talks held by the government of Oman, played the enrichment card and conveyed to the Iranians for the first time that the U.S. is willing to accept some form of enrichment on Iranian soil under very strict limitations and conditions. And that's really what truly open up the negotiations. But I can go into that in greater detail. But the point being, we have one example that worked. We have plenty of examples that did not work. Why are we, if we truly want to strengthen this deal, if we truly want to make sure that Israel's security, the issue of Hezbollah and other things are effectively addressed and we get to a better place, why are we choosing the path that in the last 37 years has not produced any results?
Next question. Yes, right here.
Hi, Mariana Osorio with the Office of Congressman Stephen Lynch. One of the arguments that the opponents of the deal have been making is that, well, you know, we're seeing Iran continuing to do the ballistic missile testing, the mischief in the region, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the arguments that folks in favor of the deal were making was, well, if we can get the nuclear issue off the table, we can then focus on these other things. Do you think that there may have been something that we could have done right after this deal went through to start working on these other issues, because then maybe we could have done something to deal with them and we wouldn't have this excuse that the opponents are now using to try to find other ways to kill it? I mean, was there an opportunity missed to start doing something on some of these other issues?
That's an excellent question. Rob, can you please take that?
Yeah, so not only did we not wait till after the deal was done, we did it during the deal. I mean, there were two summits that President Obama held with his GCC colleagues, the heads of state of the Gulf Cooperation Council, and you could go back and look at how much was discussed there in terms of how do we counter Iran's other activities, whether it's cyber, whether it's ballistic missiles, whether it's in the Gulf.
So talks with Iran, though. What about with Iran?
Okay, I'll get to that in a second. So we were trying to do things to make sure that our allies would be comforted, as you said, because they were worried about the deal. So we didn't wait for that. Now, talking to Iran about those other issues, and that's a long story. Some argue, why didn't you put it on the table during the talks? I suspect the talks would still be ongoing now with a nuclear program that would be still ongoing, and we still would not have addressed all those issues because some of them go to the heart of Iran's regime and its security doctrine. So those are going to be very tough. It's also not clear to me, if Foreign Minister Zarif were here, he probably would disagree, but I don't think the Iranians are ready for that. I don't think they're ready for that kind of discussion. Again, as Trita said, the Supreme Leader himself said, first we want to see if this works. We don't trust the Americans. If it works, maybe we could have conversations on other things. Secretary Kerry tried many times to talk about some of those other issues. He could only go so far because I don't think that the Foreign Minister of Iran had that authority. So I wish that had happened. We never banked on it. I think President Obama was pretty realistic and clear-eyed that he didn't expect that by the end of his administration there would be a fundamental transformation of the relationship. I think we were hoping that maybe we could have discussions on some of those issues, whether it's Syria, ballistic missiles, Hezbollah, whatever. I don't think that the appetite existed in Tehran. Truth be told, those are going to be extraordinarily difficult conversations because of how big the gap is. I mean, I don't need to make the Iranian argument for them, but they have very strong views about their own security doctrine, about why they need to project power forward. So I think that's going to be a tough, very tough discussion that needs to be had. We are not off to a good start, because, as both Trita and John said, you don't set the stage for an even more difficult discussion when you renege on the deal that addressed a still hard but nonetheless easier issue to tackle.
If I could follow up on her question, though, there is this other issue of the prisoners held in Iran, and that in particular I know upsets a great deal of members of Congress. These are American citizens that the Iranian government's holding. I believe there's at least 4, possibly more, some of them held for several years now. I know we managed to get a few of them freed, but the Iranians keep getting new people or hanging on to 1 or 2. And I mean, this is just...
I can't contradict anything you said. I'm in full agreement. It's an outrage. Some of them are people that I know Trita and I had known for many years. I mean, that doesn't make it... The fact that we don't know people doesn't make it any better or worse. But these are people who were unjustifiably detained and being held as pawns. So all that is true. And as you said yourself, there are still many sanctions that are still being imposed on Iran. All of our primary embargo still exists. And I think if Iran wants to have a better relationship with us, we're going to have to live up to what are international standards and release these detainees. That doesn't mean that we then sacrifice the nuclear deal, because I don't know how that's going to help get our American citizens back home.
But here's the thing that's kind of driving me crazy about this discussion, is that, you guys keep saying Iran, Iran, Iran. I mean, the Iranian government is made up of various factions. I mean, who's really in charge? I guess I'm just...
This is exactly the point.
Go ahead.
Iran has a dynamic domestic political situation. And so if you're trying to think to yourself, how do we either improve Iranian behavior or get them to make concessions on certain things that have to do with our interests, the question is, how do you do it? Now, there's some people who believe that only browbeating, sanctions, hostile rhetoric, threats of war are likely to get a positive response. They either capitulate or they continue to be pains in the butt. There are other people who are, I think, more sober-minded, who understand that inside of a dynamic domestic political situation, there are hardliners and moderates, and if you do things that concede certain things to the other side, when you make compromises, it tends to empower the moderates that have the ability to do those kinds of compromises. But now with Trump, as Trita very wisely said, the hardliners in Iran are bolstered because they're proven right. These are the guys that warned against, trusting the United States from the beginning, and we're just satisfying their priors.
But maybe let me run this by you. One of the arguments that some people on the conservative side of this argument have been making is that we should right now empower the hardliners in Iran. The idea would be that if you make them really in charge, make them even be more hardline, that it'll anger the Iranian people enough that they will take their government back. This is I've seen white papers, that have been sent to the White House on this.
But this flies in the face of every bit of scholarship that's known about this kind of situation, because what you do is you encourage a rally around the flag effect. When sanctions and other types of things that try to do this, what you're talking about, only create this rally around the flag effect, and sanctions on their own are not actually all that. They don't have a lot of utility as a foreign policy tool. You have to offer people a way out in exchange for improved actions and behavior.
Trita.
So, thank you, Noel. I'm glad you raised that point. This is not a hypothetical that we have to have a theoretical conversation about what would happen and what would the Iranian people want. It's actually very clear, because they have gone in several elections, however flawed those elections are in Iran, they have gone there and they have, every time that they've been given a chance, voted for the least bad, the least hardline option on the ballot, precisely because they don't want to go down that route. They want to see a gradual change. They want to see an opening with the United States and the Western world, and they believe, and perhaps they are in a better position to write a paper about what they want and what they think would work, that with the opening up of Iran, it will strengthen the voices inside the country that actually want interaction with the outside world, and it will eventually marginalize more hardline elements. In fact, the hardliners in Iran strongly agree with that. That's part of the reason why they're so fearful that this deal would have led to a broader rapprochement, that there would have been U.S. businesses coming in there, why they started arresting people right before the deal was struck in order to terrify people who were thinking that, okay, now Iran is open up for business, let's get into that market, let's interact with the Iranians. And let me say something that I think we should really keep in mind. Just recently, Apple and Google decided to kick out all of the apps in their store that have been produced by Iranian engineers in Iran. Iran has its own little IT sector. Almost every app you have here you can find over there. They have their own Uber and all of these different things. And it's actually become a very important part of their economy. Now, not because of any changes in the law, but because of the interpretation of the political context of the sanctions law, both Apple and Google, within the span of about 2 weeks, decided that they're going to kick out these apps from their store, which gave pretty much a death knell to many of these different companies that have actually become quite successful. Now, who do you think we're hurting here? These apps are produced by 20 to 25-year-old kids in Iran who are discovering new frontiers, who are empowering themselves vis-a-vis the state in many different ways. If you go to their offices, I can assure you, you're not going to see pictures of Ayatollah Khomeini. You're going to see pictures of Steve Jobs. They're the ones who were hit by this tough policy that actually is hurting them and is not at all hurting the hardliners. Look what the head of Kayhan newspaper said just yesterday. Kayhan is one of the most hardline newspapers in Iran, kind of like Breitbart, also peddling in a lot of fake news. He said that Trump just gave us a big gift because this hardline approach is undercutting the moderates. It's embarrassing the moderates because their gamble did not work out, while at the same time causing exactly the rally around flag phenomena that John just mentioned. So they are certainly not complaining about this. They're quite happy.
Can I put a bow on that? 8 seconds. We actually have a little bit of it. We have some experience promoting hardliner leaders in Iran. Didn't work out awesome. That's the regime that we're dealing with now. That's the reaction to the problem of our excessive meddling in this country. It's a bad route. And it's hard to tell innocent Iranians, everyday Iranian civilians, that we're really looking out for your interests. But why don't you suffer under a worse dictatorship than you are now for a little while so that we can kind of get our bones in, right?
Yes, please.
Last question.
Hang on.
To go full circle here. So we've talked about what the U.S. will do, what Europe will do. So to take her last question of what would you recommend to conservatives, what would you recommend to Iran's leadership? If you're Iran and this is occurring, what steps do you do? Do you stick to the deal and say that you'll stay with your excuse me, your European partners who do have a economic stake in your country? What do you do? If you were advising Iran, what would you advise them to do?
Rob, why don't you go ahead and start with that one, and then we'll go to Trita.
Not a matter of advising Iran, but I think that what if it would be a wise course, I suspect, for them would be to stick to the deal and to try to put the onus on the U.S. and make sure that they drive a wedge between the U.S. and the European and our European allies and say, we're the good guys here. We're living by the deal. The U.S. is not. I think they will actually do that. That's my suspicion. They will hold to that up until the point when, as I said earlier, the economic benefits of the deal start drying up, because then those in Iran who are in favor of this approach have no argument left. Not only is the U.S. violating the deal, but it's having an effect on their economy. So I think that if I were an Iranian leader, that's what I would do. I would stick to it, try to get the Europeans on my side, try to convince them to continue to do business despite the threat of secondary sanctions. At some point, that may no longer be tenable, but that is what I suspect they should and will continue to do. I don't know if Trita agrees or not.
But Trita, before you say, I just want to make one other thing clear. The secondary sanctions, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is really important to understand. A lot of the U.S. sanctions that were imposed on Iran to get them to come to talk, and which were lifted, were secondary sanctions, which actually were imposed on companies in other countries, or threatened to be imposed on companies in other countries that would do business with Iran. So the whole idea with secondary sanctions isn't just to punish Iranian firms, it's to punish firms outside of Iran that might want to do business with Iran. And so if Congress reimposes those sanctions, that's kind of the stick that they hold over companies in Europe. It's this idea that they will get punished and kept out of the U.S. system if they do any business with Iran. And that's a really big, significant point. So I want to make sure people understand that. Trita, please go ahead.
Thank you. This is not about giving a recommendation. I'm just going to share with you what I think they're likely to do. Part of it, I think, is perhaps good in the sense of making sure that the deal doesn't get killed. Ultimately, I think that would be very bad if it was. But right now, notice that they're keeping a relatively low profile. And I think that is because of their calculation that Trump is shooting himself in the foot, isolating the United States, and as a result, they have no interest in interfering while he's doing that. But the area that I really worry about is that, particularly when combined with these suggestions, some of them quite explicit about regime change, that's going to lead to a much, much tougher position of Iran in the region. Rather than seeing a rollback, et cetera, on the contrary, we're going to see them actually become much more aggressive in the region as a result of this. That's my big worry.
Rob, can I ask you one thing? I know a lot of your concern is about preventing nuclear war and those types of big things. But what is it like on a personal level to see something that you worked on so hard in the previous administration, like all these things that you helped build, come under threat of being thrown out? Like, how is it personally to watch this play out in the White House?
So my wife works on healthcare, so you can imagine our dinner conversations. Listen, I try not to personalize it, although I admit that I probably get more passionate about this than some other issues. Obviously, it doesn't feel great, but I do think, there's some issues on which, even legacy issues, on which I'm quite ambivalent. If you told me, what about our policy on this or that, I might say, well, we might not have gotten it entirely right. On this one, not only do I feel personally invested, I genuinely feel that this is one of those rare no-brainers where it just really doesn't. I don't understand, other than those who think we shouldn't be dealing with Iran because we should really try to squeeze them and asphyxiate them and hope that the regime will change. But those who think we can get a better deal this way, I genuinely don't understand that argument. So it's not, I don't think it's a matter of personal feelings, even though, as you said, it's never good to see several years of work. But, I'm not, others are going to suffer more than I will if there is a confrontation in the region. If, in fact, the regime, as Trita says, if the hardliners in the regime use this to crack down, I mean, a lot of, if the Iranians retaliate in Iraq or in Syria, our troops, our men and women in uniform are going to suffer. So my own personal feelings, which I won't deny exist, are not the primary thing. And as I said, it really is a case. I try to always have an open mind. I work at an organization, the International Crisis Group, whose motto is to put ourselves in other people's shoes. That's what we do for a living. It's very hard for me to understand the argument, not of those who think Iran is a bad actor and we should never have made any concession to them, but of those who think this is a way to improve the deal. Because every bone in my body tells me that's not going to work. And I ask all of you to put yourselves in the shoes of an Iranian. Why would they accept, with a gun to their head, that says, if you don't agree to more concessions, unilateral concessions than you agreed to so far, we're going to take away this deal. Now come to the negotiating table. That makes no sense, whether you're Iranian, Chinese, Russian, French, or American. It's just not the way you do business. And that's why I am alarmed, because I think we're, as I said, we're presenting this choice to the Iranians, which basically they can only say no to. It's an offer that they can only refuse.
I think we have time for one more question. All right, go ahead, Medea.
So I'm still confused with all of this. There are nuclear-related sanctions, which are these secondary sanctions. There are non-nuclear related sanctions. Trita, you said that if that either of those would be bad. But yet, if there is nothing, then Trump says he is going to undo the deal through these nuclear-related sanctions. So isn't it better to have non-nuclear-related sanctions, or can Congress do nothing in the next 60 days? And how do we secure that Congress does nothing? I've heard that we should try to push Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell that nothing goes to the floor. So if you could be real specific about the next 60 days.
This is really fascinating, someone urging Congress to actually do nothing. Trita, go ahead, I guess.
So I think it's important to keep in mind, it is not just so that if you have nuclear-based sanctions snapping back or imposed, that would be a violation. If you have sanctions, even if they're on the basis of any other issue, terrorism, human rights, but it is actually targeting Iran's general trade rather than actually being targeted, that is still a violation of the deal. Because otherwise, essentially, we have broad-based sanctions that were lifted as a carrot to the Iranians in order for them to agree to restrictions. And then immediately after they've done so, we reimpose those sanctions in a different form with a different basis. Obviously, that's not going to work. So that is a violation as well. And that's where I think there might be some difficulty, because everything the U.S. Congress is looking at is going to really be difficult to find new areas of sanctions that haven't already been sanctioned, that aren't already sanctions, because we have probably more sanctions on Iran still today than we have on almost any other country. Even the sanctions that we've said have been lifted have not been lifted. They've been waived, and they have to continue to be waived every 120 or 180 days. So the no action approach is in the sense of no action in the sense of adopting new sanctions. But there's plenty of other things that can be done. A, making sure we live up to the deal, respect the deal, honor it in good faith, and then re-engage in diplomacy in order to be able to address those very same issues that people say, in many ways legitimately, are concerns. But
okay, we're actually like almost out of time. I just want to end this on a somewhat light note. If I remember correctly, President Trump referred to it as the Arabian Gulf, right? And I can just say one thing, like, there's no way to make Iranians more united against you than to refer to the Persian Gulf as the Arabian Gulf. And I think, is it fair to say he might have just lost Iranians pretty much with that?
He lost Iranians overwhelmingly with the Muslim ban in January already, because the vast majority of people who were affected by this were Iranians. And there was really no security basis for that whatsoever. There's no cases of any Iranians coming here engaged in any act of lethal terror. On the contrary, it's been a very productive thing for the United States. So already there, and now we're in the third iteration of the Muslim ban, he has no credibility claiming that he wants the best for the Iranian people and that he's reaching out to them. I mean, they're laughing at him.
So he could argue he really has nothing to lose.
He has nothing to lose.
Thank you all so much. Really appreciate this. And remember to give me your business cards. Thank you.
Well, based on